So we have quite a number of questions, so we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So the first question to our panel: if you have carcinoid syndrome, how often should you have a heart examination? Dr. Anthony, do you want to take a crack at that?
There's not a set rule, so I think the individual aspects of the case needs to be considered. But in general, if there's signs of carcinoid heart disease, then it's related to symptoms. And so the most frequent would be maybe a couple of times a year, to the most infrequent would be a few times, maybe every other year or so. There's another product called brain natriuretic peptide, we call it BNP. This is probably a better marker to monitor people over time for carcinoid heart disease. So people who have elevated serotonin levels, particularly markedly elevated, or 5-HIA, then the BNP really should be part of the screening. You have any comments on that, Dr. Chauhan?
So I just learned some new science regarding this last week when we were at Montreal for our National Neuroendocrine Tumor Society Symposium. So MD Anderson's spearheading some research in this aspect, because carcinoid heart disease sort of understudied. What's the best way to screen? I usually use Dr. Anthony's Spidey sense in terms of how to monitor. Right now, that can vary from doing an echo every 6 months to almost every other year based on severity, individual patients. However, there are newer forms of screening modalities being tested, like BNP is one of those. Some people are doing cardiac MRIs. Some people are doing some measurement based on echocardiogram, the flow velocity going through the pulmonic valve or different valves. So it's being studied, and there are drugs being studied. For example, Zermello. We heard about Zermello for carcinoid syndrome. So a study called TeleHeart study is going to be studying effects or benefits of Zermello for carcinoid heart disease. Okay. So this is sort of an understudied, but I'm glad that our investigators are kind of focusing on trying to develop really, good ways, validated ways to monitor this. But yes, usually if I have a patient who have elevated serotonin, I like to at least get a baseline echocardiogram. Many times they already have one, so we don't have to repeat it as long as it's normal. And if the serotonin is well controlled, then I'm less worried. But if the serotonin continues to be elevated, then I like to kind of monitor once a year echo, or at least once every other year. Sort of kind of depends on individual patients and how they're doing.
So most medical oncologists really do not monitor for carcinoid heart disease. We actually did a poll with the sponsor of the TeleHeart to see how many medical oncologists were concerned about carcinoid heart, and it's close to zero. I'll just be honest with you. So I think these kind of conferences where we engage the patient is really important. Now, Mayo Clinic in Rochester is really the key center in the U.S., so I send complex carcinoid heart patients to Mayo.
Okay, that's great. So there's some very, very sophisticated questions here. So I think our audience is very well educated already and asking very good questions. So I'm going to put two questions together which have a similar theme. The first is, what medications can interfere with serotonin levels? And then there's a separate question, does thyroid medications interfere with serotonin levels?
So the first part of that, we are concerned if you collect 24-hour urine, there's quite a few medications that you have to avoid for urine collection. But in general, we don't really have to screen people's drugs to interpret their serotonin levels. So I think it's a holdover from the past. Certain drugs could potentially interfere with drug-drug interactions that we're concerned about in therapeutics. But as far as serotonin goes, we're pretty fortunate now We don't have to put people on special diets. We don't have to screen their drug medications. Now, as it relates to thyroid hormone is a really, it's a difficult hormone to use. The preparation has to be the right one for the right patient and the dose. So, and it can be sensitive to different changes in health. So I think as a medical oncologist, we rely more on primary care docs and endocrinologists really to fine tune the Synthroid, which is probably one of the most frequent ones used. But I'm not really aware of serotonin and Synthroid to really be concerned about it. How about you, Aman?
Right, and that's where I completely agree with the sort of a multidisciplinary approach to management of NETs, because we can't really know everything, right? Especially the medicines are evolving. Like just 2 weeks back, you've heard of this drug called Ozempic, right? Ozempic for weight loss, and there are other, so is there any interactions? And there'll be new drugs coming every week for high blood pressure, diabetes, and things like that. So we really engage our pharmacists, right? Because they are very well in tune with drug-drug interaction and how things and you will have one of our pharmacists, she's a very smart clinical pharmacist, Sasha Watson, and anytime I have a drug-drug interaction question, I call her, hey, is there something that I need to be worried about it? Now, for carcinoid syndrome and serotonin level, yes, there is a laundry list of drugs which you can Google. Some of these drugs are seizure medications. Some of these could be diuretics. But I agree with Dr. Anthony. There's probably a hangover from the past. Our assays are much better, much more refined and sophisticated. I don't think that those medications really affect the serotonin assessment to that extent. Now, there are unique situations where patients been referred to us for elevated serotonin or urinary 5-HIA, but we can't find the disease. The colonoscopies, endoscopies, the dotatate PETs are all negative. In those kind of cases, we really have to then take a deep dive and understand, is there an environmental factor? Are there medications involved? Are there some other factors beyond a neuroendocrine tumor that could cause this? Because there are things that can cause elevated 5-HIA. So just having an elevated 5-HIA or serotonin is not diagnostic. We have to be very careful. You have to really find other potential causes and some health supplement or health foods that could have causing some of this. Certain foods in general or fruits can cause it. So you have to be very careful with that. But fortunately, that's a very rare situation. Majority of times, it's a pretty standard, and it doesn't affect to that extent.
Okay, and there's a related question. Does aromatase inhibitors, such as Arimidex, decrease serotonin levels? And I can answer that. I think the answer is no, but I actually just texted our clinical pharmacist who's going to be here later today, and I should get an answer for you shortly. There's another serotonin-related question. So there's a class of drugs used as antidepressants called SSRIs, selective serotonin release uptake inhibitors, which are used, such as Prozac and Zoloft. These are very commonly used drugs. So the question is, are there any data or any studies to show that these drugs could increase the risk of neuroendocrine tumors?
I can go first on this one. So, SSRIs are one very common drugs. One of the thought process in depression is that there is lower level of serotonin, and SSRIs block the serotonin uptake, so it kind of increases that serotonin between the two neurons and kind of uplifts the mood. That's how that works. Then that worries our patients because, we are trying to lower the serotonin by our medication. Can that, or SSRIs of increasing serotonin, can that affect the neuroendocrine tumors? So in real world, what we notice that it has no bearing on the outcomes and the experience of our patients. The serotonin and the SSRIs for depression and these situations is more limited to central nervous system and neurons, right? And which is well protected by what's called blood-brain barrier. So whatever is happening there is happening within the confines of the CNS. The serotonin, which is really impacting us in our area of work, is the tumor secreted serotonin. And Dr. Anthony showed and the effect of it on the gut and the enteric neurons. So the peripheral nervous system, right? We have some data. There were some publications from Dana-Farber which studies, and there was no difference in terms of outcomes between patients who were on SSRIs or not. So for all practical purposes, I would like to reassure our patients, if they need to be on SSRIs, then please feel free. There is no issues with being on SSRIs. It doesn't make your carcinoid syndrome worse. Depression, anxiety, those are real issues and can impact your quality of life. Don't, refrain from taking medicines which can help you live a better quality of life. There is absolutely no data that I'm aware of that it causes worsening of carcinoid syndrome or outcomes in neuroendocrine tumor patients. Dr. Anthony, what is your take on that?
So pharma companies in the U.S. or in the world really are not going to study patients with carcinoid syndrome and SSRIs. You'd think that there would be some basic science people or some non-governmental support of that, and that's really come from Canada. The health system in Canada, actually, they looked over their database and they saw that their patients with carcinoid syndrome on SSRIs really did not have any outcomes that were unpredictable outside of the normal expectations of side effects. So you can use these drugs, use them safely. They work for a while. Sometimes they have to be switched over to other ones. But some people are concerned that there's greater psychiatric disease in neuroendocrine tumor patients. I don't think that's the case either. What do you think, Aman?
I'll let you kind of research that out for me. I think this is an understudied area, and and sometimes I feel that we might have a little bit of an observer's bias because we are both high volume net centers. We only focus on neuroendocrine tumors, and patients come from all across the U.S. So sometimes patients would tell us, "Hey, doc, my neighbor had this and this." So they're trying to kind of create some sort of commonality, for example, autoimmune conditions and neuroendocrine tumor, or so because we sort of attract right? So a group might know other people with a similar sort of condition, and then they connect together because they also have neuroendocrine tumor. So we have to be very careful because to study a causality, that means something which is linked, needs a very high volume and rigorous studies, right? And that's one of our issues. To date, we don't really have a good understanding of what causes neuroendocrine tumor. Is other conditions, be it psychological, psychosomatic, or are they truly linked, or are they just happen to be bystander? And would there be a study of that nature in a relatively rare cancer like neuroendocrine tumor? Probably not. Just imagine it took us years and decades before we could find and confirm that smoking causes lung cancer, which is such a common cancer. And smoking, everybody used to smoke, from surgeons to everybody back in the days, right? So that's the kind of studies and data that is needed to confirm. So I don't think, but yeah, sometimes we kind of get persuaded by patients and kind of try to start seeing some commonalities. Oh, certain conditions are linked to NETs, but I don't know if it's just an observer's bias because we are seeing all these NETs patients traveling to us who nobody else is kind of paying attention to because they're kind of brushing their symptoms on the carpet. So my jury is still out, I think, Dr. Anthony. I don't know.
Okay. Just to close off that, the question about Arimidex, so far we didn't find any evidence that Arimidex can affect serotonin levels, and our pharmacist is going to be here later, so you can engage her as well. Next question along the same lines. So Zermelo or Telitrestat, Dr. Anthony is the expert in that, led the studies that led to the approval. So the question is, can you use Zermelo only when your diarrhea comes on instead of constant use because of possible constipation? In other words, can you use Zermelo as needed?
I also want to add, he was the first one to prescribe it. I remember I was a fellow with him. The drug was just FDA. Right patient. First guy in the country to prescribe.
Those were the days when we used to write it out. We don't write prescriptions out anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Zermello costs, if you look at the cost of it, it's about the same as lanreotide. An oral drug you take 3 times a day costs as much as a monthly injectable. So when the FDA approved this product, they did not want it to be an expensive Imodium. So the answer to the question is no. It is not a PRN drug.
PRN means as needed. So in other words,
So the problem is that the only side effect to Zermello is constipation. So people will get constipated and they'll stop taking it, or they'll show up in the ER. We had some early outcomes like that and said, oh my God, we can't give it to you like the drug says. And so I had people actually accumulate probably months and months of supply because they couldn't take it 3 times a day. But when they would get shipment, it's always 90 pills, 90 pills, 90 pills. You take one a month or you take 90 a month, you get the same amount. So it's going to be, if your pharmacy benefits insurance pays for it, you're going to get 90 pills a month, whether you want it or not.
So, it is a scheduled medicine. You have to, the way they designed the schedule that is every 8 hours or 3 times a day is based on the pharmacokinetics. That means the blood levels, how much is absorbed, how much it stays in the body, etc. And that's how it was studied in the clinical trial, the Telestars trial. However, in real world, we always have to make accommodations, right? So in those rare situations where patient could not tolerate 3 times a day because of belly pain, cramps, or constipation, I have tried 2 times a day, and it has worked in certain situations. And then other times, if patient's not tolerated, then you just have to sacrifice and just stop it altogether. So although it's not recommended to go to twice a day or once a day, but I have tried it because the other alternative is either come off the pills and they have terrible carcinoid diarrhea. So I try to kind of find a middle ground. But that's not how it was studied.
So the indication is for diarrhea if the somatostatin analog does not work. So I was very much interested in saying, well, why do you even need a somatostatin analogs? Why not just go ahead and use the Zermello by itself? And it's not really approved to be used that way. I don't think we have a lot of experience like that. So that's another common question that comes up.
Okay. All right. So we have a few questions related to PRRT. So first one, do you need to continue sandostatin treatment following successful PRRT?
All right, I'll take that one. So I just shot a podcast with a very famous net specialist from England, Dr. Martin Kaplan. He actually led the PROMID study that we discussed earlier. And this was the discussion of our podcast, that should we continue somatostatin analog with PRT? See, the conventional wisdom in any cancer is you start a patient on a drug till it's working. And once it stops working, then it's not working. You stop that drug and change the gears and try a new drug, right? So if somebody was on sandostatin or lanreotide and was working well and then eventually stopped working, we are shifting gears to Lutathera, then you might say, let's stop it, right? That's the conventional wisdom. However, the way the NETTER-1 study was designed, patient who got the Lutathera also continued to get sandostatin, right? We just don't know what is that added benefit of continuing the SSA, but that's how it was studied. That's one thing. The second is, whenever somebody has progression, there is a decent amount of disease which is still relatively stable. And then there are these bad clones of cells which are progressing. So an argument can be made in those situations that, okay, SSA probably still has some activity. Sandostatin or lanreotide is still probably working in certain areas, while the other areas which are progressing, we are changing treatment and it's probably going to work. But to be honest, we don't really have a good data whether adding or continuing somatostatin analog beyond progression works or not. We have 2 conflicting studies. One was published from Germany, which showed that if patient gets the Lutathera and continues SSA with it and beyond it, they did much better as compared to stopping it. It was a single center, small study, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. There was another study done from Poland which showed the opposite result, that patient did worse by continuing. Again, single center, retrospective, so a lot of biases. Whenever you are doing like a retrospective study, you kind of data mining, and there's a lot of issues with those kind of studies. So there's no prospective study to tell us half the patient just got Lutathera and other half got Lutathera plus somatostatin analog and continued it. Only that kind of study will tell us. So what do? If somebody has carcinoid syndrome, that means flushing or diarrhea, no question, they need to continue it, okay? Because sandostatin lanreotide is not only controlling the cancer, but it's also controlling the syndrome. So we need to control the syndrome regardless. But those patients who don't have syndrome, I give patient an option. I tell them the data. I tell them, hey, this is how it was studied, but I don't know, and the field doesn't know, is it truly needed? So the field is sort of divided half and half. Sometimes shots are literally pain in the butt, right? So, if patient has had shots for 5 years and now switching to Lutathera, they appreciate a little break from continuing the shot, and especially if they don't have syndrome. So I'd really have that discussion with the patient and sometimes give them a little break, and then we can always resume after we are done with Lutathera, because Lutathera is just 4 doses. After that, there's nothing for maintenance. That's sort of my practice. Dr. Anthony, what do you do in Kentucky?
Since there's conflicting data, I make it on individual patient decisions, what's best for that patient. Quality of life is really what it's all about. So I'd continue it if symptoms are present. And sometimes it's helpful to actually hold a dose or two after the last dose of Lutathera if there's a question. And usually within 2 or 3 month period, you'll find out whether Lutathera was enough to maybe suppress the symptoms for a while. But if not, I think it's the standard of care really to use the product for supportive care.
Okay. So next question again, kind of in a similar vein. Can you develop a tolerance to an SSA drug, specifically lanreotide? Essentially, does it become less effective with long-term use?
Theoretically, yes. This concept is called tachyphylaxis. So anytime you use a drug and it has a target or a receptor, and you continues to flood that receptor or stimulate that receptor, what the body does, it gets desensitized and it down-regulates that receptor. And that's true for not just neuroendocrine tumor, any condition, any drug. Okay, and that's why a lot of the drugs lose some of its effectiveness, and because of that concept. Does it happen in neuroendocrine tumors? It's not very well studied. It's difficult. This concept is difficult to study. We don't see that, fortunately, in most of our patients. Some of our patients, yes, eventually they will lose control, and then we have to increase the dose of sandostatin or increase the frequency from every 4 weeks to every 3 weeks. But my counter to that is it really lack of effectiveness or the disease getting worse? There are more tumors secreting more serotonin. So is it the drug's not working as well, or is just drug not enough now in the newer scenario? So there is a doubt, but theoretically, yes, the tumors can get desensitized, and you have to kind of give higher dose or not. Now, we live in an era where we have more than one drug to treat neuroendocrine tumor patients, and we will hear some of the approaches. So when somebody is having more carcinoid syndrome or functional syndrome symptoms, drugs are not the only way. We can do surgeries to debulk the tumor that lowers the serotonin or other functional syndrome load, and that helps our drugs work even better. We can embolize the tumor, so there are liver-directed therapies. So there are more than one tool. Medicine is just one of them, okay? Yes, short answer to your question is theoretically yes, but I have my doubts.
So this has been an important question that's in front of us for decades. And as we were investigating this in the 1990s, we were under the impression that the more drug we gave, the better the outcome. The problem is the drug was expensive to make, and you can only get so much drug in with each injection. To solve that, at least the second problem, Novartis came up with a new formulation called octreotide pamoate. The pamoate salt went under trials in breast cancer and in limited centers in Europe for neuroendocrine tumors. But the bottom line is, if you go to about 10 times the levels that we were at now, so much, much higher quantities of the drug so that you're occupying more of the receptor, Dr. Oberg's group found that about 15% of people would actually respond to those higher levels. So I think now we've got a study called the Comaru study that we hopefully will start hearing more about in a year or two, where they have been given higher doses of this drug every other week, where people can self-administer it. So the answer to the question is unknown today, not practical in the drugs that we have today, but stay tuned. And I'd say in about 1 or 2 years, do they have any Comaru data update at NANETS?
No, I think the study is still open for enrollment, but I anticipate it'll close very soon. So your timeline is about right. I think we have to wait about a year and a half before we know. Yeah, and
Okay.
that study might actually throw some light on the higher dose of SSA control.
All right. We have just a few minutes left in the session, so I'm going to try to get through some of the remaining questions. There was a question about copper-64 and gallium-68 dotatate imaging, and that will be addressed in the next talk by Dr. Cooker when he talks about nuclear medicine imaging. So another PRRT-related question, how long do patients who have benefit from lutetium-177 after the 6 cycles, how long can that benefit last?
Okay. So on an average in the NETR-1 study, the benefit lasted about 28, 29 months. But of course, that's just one study. If you look into your European data, there's some studies which suggest 40, 50 months as well. And then there are other little bit modest, about 20 to 25 months. But that's the rough ballpark range. Majority of patients will have benefit. It's only 10 to 15% patients who don't benefit at all. That means they just progress right through it. Fortunately, that number is just very limited, 1 in 10. Majority benefit, and we can expect benefit to last from 1 to 3 years based on individual patients' response to the therapies. Now, that's where we are looking at the next generation of PRT. Can we extend that durability of response to maybe twice that time? And Dr. Anthony and I are working on not one but multiple such studies and adding a drug X to the PRRT, kind of increasing the effectiveness of PRRT.
Okay, and then some of the remaining questions we can answer relatively quickly. So, has lutetium-177 been shown to be effective in any other cancer type apart from neuroendocrine tumors?
So yes, so lutetium-177 dotatate is a radiopharmaceutical which targets somatostatin receptor. It has nothing to do with neuroendocrine tumor. So if your tumor has somatostatin receptor, it theoretically will work. So what other cancer has somatostatin receptors? There are certain tumors like Merkel cell cancer. So there are some anecdotal case reports. It's out in public, which had somatostatin receptor and benefited. Other tumors like neuroblastoma. I've been referred patients who don't have any other treatment options, and I don't even treat neuroblastoma. But since I do Lutathera and they have somatostatin receptor, I've treated and have had some successful results. I know Dr. Anthony has also treated meningioma. There are other tumor types which express somatostatin receptors. And in the newer studies that we are opening, we will explore other cancers like small cell lung cancers, again, critical unmet need cancer, which also tend to have somatostatin receptors, and we'll see use of these agents in other tumor types as well. So yeah, stay tuned. We are exploring these other cancers as well beyond NETs.
Okay, and I think this is a very important question for patients considering clinical trials. So if a patient is in a phase 1 trial, will they move to phase 2, or will they continue if they are responding? And what if a patient has a complete response? Will they have to undergo maintenance?
Okay. Dr. Anthony, you want to take the first part? I'll take the maintenance one.
So this is a phase 1. If someone enters a phase 1 trial, you enter in a specific dose level, and you're followed and treated accordingly. So you don't go to phase 2 because you're already part of that phase 1. Is that the question?
Right. So yes, essentially, if you're in a study and you're benefiting from the study, most times we would continue. We in most phase 1 trials, any patient who's benefiting, even if the trial finishes, most times you can get an opportunity to continue the same treatment going forward. And phase 2 is a completely separate goal usually to show effectiveness and in a larger population. So I think we're running out of time on this session, but there are a couple of questions that I think we can probably answer during the break. There's somebody asked about CAR T cell treatment. I actually run a number of CAR T studies. So somebody, if you wrote this question, please find me during the break and I can talk to you about it. Another question about will we be using theranostics earlier in the disease course with newer treatment options becoming available, and there's a new study on that. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to talk about NETA2.
I think we can roll off. These are important questions, and we'll have some afternoon Q&A sessions, important questions.
Yeah.
But yes, there is a NETA2 study which was reported to be positive. We are waiting the final data, but looks like there is some role of earlier use of priority-based therapies, and maybe now not waiting for second line and front line in certain select group, like higher grade 2 and grade 3 patients. We can handle some of those questions next session.
And then the last one, I don't want to leave anybody out. Somebody asked, will artificial intelligence be used to develop new treatments for neuroendocrine tumors?
Oh my goodness, we are all worried for our job security. It's not too far. You'll have an app as a net specialist app, and say, hey, this is my symptom, and they just check you out. I'm kidding. I think artificial intelligence making inroads in medicine in general. I think the softwares who are reading our scans or pathology slides are in development, and there are some pilot data showing promising results. I don't know if Dr. Cooker, our radiology colleagues, worried about those. But I think we will use it to our benefit. We are at University of Miami. I think we are already using some of these softwares in drug development processes, because what happens is, when you see one drug here, there are thousands of agents already pre-tested that make it to this stage of testing. So how do we find those thousands of agents? Is a lot of permutation, combination, targets, and big data behind. So AI, because it can process so much data so much more efficiently than humans can really help out in finding that needle in the haystack. But eventually, I think when it comes to delivery of the treatment to the patient level, that's why medicine is not a science, it's an art. You have to have that patient-doctor relationship. And I don't think that the AI would ever be able to replace that human aspect of this interaction. So I think the AI is here to stay. It's going to continue to grow and evolve, and for the benefit for all of us.
So AI is a tool to make us all better, really. So it could be used for negativity, but I think in our area we want to think positive. So yes, it's another tool in our toolbox.
All right, thank you very much for your participation. So we'll have a lot more opportunities for questions later in the day, and I'll turn it back over to Bob.